The local people had a name for the mountain long before any of this happened. Kholat Syakhl. In the language of the Mansi, who had hunted those forests for centuries, it means dead mountain. They tended to stay away from it. In the winter of 1959, 9 experienced hikers climbed it anyway. Not one of them came back alive. And what was found on that slope over the weeks that followed has resisted every explanation for 65 years. The tent torn open from the inside, the bodies scattered half-dressed across a frozen hillside, the injuries that looked like a high-speed collision on a mountain where nothing had hit them. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass. Stay with me to the end, because the closer you look, the stranger it gets. And then, right when you think you understand it, stranger still. Let's start with who they were, because it matters. They were not careless tourists. They were students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, some of the most capable winter trekkers in the Soviet Union, led by a calm, precise 23-year-old named Igor Dyatlov. With him were 8 others, most in their early 20s. Zina Kolmogorova, bright and full of life, Rustam Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, Georgy Krivonischenko, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, who went by Kolya, Alexander Kolevatov, 20-year-old Ludmila Dubinina, an economics student with a fierce streak who had already survived 1 wilderness accident, and the oldest among them by far, 38-year-old Semyon Zolotaryov, a decorated war veteran and ski instructor who had joined the group almost at the last minute. There was a 10th member, Yuri Yudin, who fell ill early and turned back before the mountain. That illness saved his life. He spent the rest of it haunted by the fact. Their goal was a peak called Otorten, by the hardest grade of route the Soviet system recognized, in the dead of a Ural winter. They were ready for it. And we know they were happy because we have their cameras and their diaries. The photographs they took in those final days show a group laughing in the snow, mugging for the lens, building their tent, thoroughly enjoying themselves. There is no shadow in those pictures, no sense of what was coming. Just young people, days from the end, having the time of their lives. On the last day of January, the weather turned hard. Heavy wind, low visibility. And on February 1st, the group made a choice that would become the first question without an answer. Instead of camping in the shelter of the forest below, they pitched their tent high on the open, exposed slope of Dead Mountain, cutting a flat shelf into the snow of the hillside to do it. Their last diary notes are calm. A joke passed around. A line about the stove. Nothing wrong. And then, sometime in the black hours between February 1st and 2nd, something happened inside that tent that turned 9 disciplined, experienced people into something else entirely. They cut their way out. Not the door. The wall. From the inside with a knife, slashing through the canvas. And they went out into a night of howling wind and temperatures plunging toward 40 below zero. Most of them with no coats, no boots, some in nothing but socks. They left everything behind. Their food still set out, their boots in a row. A flashlight, left on top of the tent, still switched on. Every single thing a human being needs to survive a night in that cold, abandoned, as they fled downhill toward a tree line a mile away. Think about what that means. These were people who understood exactly what that cold would do to an unprotected body. And whatever was in that tent with them or outside it, they judged it more deadly than the night that was about to kill them. 3 weeks passed before searchers found the tent, half collapsed and buried in drift, its wall cut open from within. And then they began to find the hikers. At the edge of the forest, a mile down the slope, beneath a tall cedar tree, they found the first 2, stripped down to their underwear beside the cold remains of a small fire. The branches of that cedar were snapped off as high as 15 feet up, as though someone had clawed their way up the trunk in the dark to look back toward the tent. Their hands were burned, and one of them had bitten clean through his own knuckle. Strung out across the slope between the cedar and the tent, as if they had been crawling back uphill toward shelter, lay 3 more. Igor Dyatlov, one hand still gripping a small branch. Zina Kalmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin, who had a fracture in his skull. All 3 were pointed the same way, back toward the tent. They had died trying to return to it. 5 of them now, and the explanation, as grim as it was, still sat within the bounds of the ordinary. They had fled into the cold, and the cold had taken them. But 4 hikers were still missing, and when the snow finally melted that May, and the last 4 were found in a ravine deeper in the woods, buried under more than a dozen feet of snow, the ordinary explanation died with them. 3 of the 4 had devastating internal injuries. Kolya Thibobrignols had a major fracture of the skull. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had massive crushing injuries to the chest, ribs broken and driven inward. The doctor who examined them, a forensic expert named Boris Vozrozdeny, said the force required would be comparable to a car crash or the pressure wave of a powerful blast. And then he said the thing that has haunted this case ever since. There were almost no external wounds, no matching bruises, no broken skin. Whatever shattered the bones beneath had left the surface of the body nearly untouched, as if they had been crushed by some enormous, even pressure out of nowhere. And there was one more detail, the one that has burned itself into this story for 65 years. Ludmila Dubinina, found kneeling face down in the meltwater of a small stream, was missing her eyes, her tongue, and part of her lips. Zolotaryov, beside her, was also missing his eyes. Kolevatov was missing his eyebrows. That is the scene. 9 experienced people flee a warm tent into lethal cold. Some claw up a tree, some crawl back toward shelter and freeze. And 4 end up at the bottom of a ravine with the kind of injuries you would expect from a car wreck, and no marks to show for it. One of them with her tongue gone. And over it all, 2 more details that turned a tragedy into a legend. Some of the clothing, when tested, carried traces of radiation. And another group of hikers, 50 kilometers away that same night, reported watching strange glowing orange spheres drift across the northern sky toward Dead Mountain. For 65 years, that is where the story usually stops. On the impossibility of it, the slashed tent, the crushing force with no bruises, the missing tongue, the radiation, the lights in the sky. It looks laid out like that, like something no natural force could have done. So let's actually do the thing almost no telling of this story bothers to do. Let's turn the lights on and follow the evidence one piece at a time. Because nearly every single one of those impossibilities has an answer. And the answers are, in their own way, just as gripping. Start with the most disturbing image, the missing eyes and tongue. It sounds like deliberate mutilation, like something was done to her. But the truth is grounded, and it is gentler than the legend. Dubinina was found face down in running snowmelt, and she had been there for 3 months. The eyes, the tongue, the soft tissue of the lips are the most delicate parts of the body and the first to go to water and to the small scavengers of a forest. The examiner himself concluded these losses happened after death, from the stream and from time. Not from a blade and not from a beast. Now the radiation. The detail that launched 1,000 secret weapon theories. Some of the hikers' clothing did carry traces of radioactivity. Unsettling until you follow the thread. Just 2 years earlier, that very region of the Soviet Union had suffered the KYSHTYM disaster, one of the worst nuclear accidents in history. And one of the hikers, Krivonischenko, had worked as an engineer in nuclear cleanup. Trace contamination on the clothes of people from that world, in that place, in that era, is strange. But it is explainable, and it points nowhere stranger than ordinary Cold War life. Now the hardest one, the crushing injuries. The car crash force with no wounds on the skin. For decades this seemed to demand something violent and unknown. Then in 2021, a team of physicists and engineers published a study in a serious scientific journal, and they modeled that exact slope. They found something subtle and devastating. The flat shelf the hikers had cut into the snow to pitch their tent had quietly undermined the snow above them. All night, fierce mountain winds kept loading more snow onto that weakened slab. And after a delay of hours, long enough that by morning there would be no obvious avalanche to see, that slab could let go. Not a roaring wall of snow. A heavy, dense block sliding down onto people lying in a tent. And a load like that, pressing bodies against the hard floor they were lying on, can crack ribs and fracture a skull with exactly the force the doctor described. And leave the skin unbroken because the pressure is broad and even. That one study reframes the entire night. Picture it now with the lights on. In the dark, a slab of snow releases and slams down onto the tent. People are badly hurt. Kolya's skull, the crushed chest. The rest are certain a bigger collapse is coming. They can't claw the buried entrance open fast enough, so they cut through the wall. They drag and carry their injured friends downhill toward the only shelter in sight, the tree line a mile below. They build a fire under the cedar. They try to dig a snow shelter. They take clothing from those who die first to keep the living warm a little longer, which is exactly why Dubinina was found wearing a dead friend's torn trousers. And then, one by one, in the dark and the wind and the impossible cold, they lose. And here is the quiet detail that holds the whole grounded picture together. The footprints leading down from the tent were not the prints of 9 people running blind from a monster. They were spaced like people walking, steady, deliberate. A wounded, frightened, disciplined group making a hard retreat. Not a stampede from something in the dark. Put it all together and the impossible scene resolves into something coherent and human and almost unbearably sad. A bad decision about where to camp, a delayed slab of snow, catastrophic injuries in the dark, and a doomed, courageous fight to survive that the cold simply outlasted. When the Russian government reopened the case and concluded its work around 2020, this is essentially the answer it reached. A snow slab, low visibility, a forced retreat, and death by hypothermia. In the words of the lead prosecutor, it was a heroic struggle. That is almost certainly what happened on Dead Mountain. Not aliens, not a Yeti, not a secret weapon in the night. 9 brave and capable people, and a mountain that punished one small mistake with no mercy at all. And that is where an honest telling could end. Except this is a story that has never quite let itself be closed. And not by cranks, by the people closest to it. Because the grounded explanation, as good as it is, still leaves a thin seam that won't quite seal. The snow slab model is elegant, but it isn't unanimous. The slope was shallower than the terrain where slabs usually release. The searchers who reached the tent first reported seeing no avalanche debris at all. And some experienced mountaineers and forensic analysts still argue that the timeline doesn't fully fit. That the question of who could still move and how far and for how long after injuries like that doesn't completely add up. And then there are the spheres. On the night the hikers died, that second group of seasoned trekkers, 50 kilometers south, reported watching glowing orange spheres move across the northern sky. They weren't alone. Similar lights were reported in that region over the following weeks. By other hikers and by local police. That is documented testimony from credible people. It is not part of the legend. It is part of the record. And the strangest piece of all comes not from a conspiracy theorist, but from the man who ran the original investigation. His name was Lev Ivanov. Decades later, in 1990, he came forward and admitted that he had been ordered, from above, to close the case and classify what he had found. And he confessed something else, that he personally believed those flying spheres were connected to the deaths of these 9 people, and that he had been made to bury that belief along with the case. Maybe that was nothing more than the reflex of a secretive state. Maybe there was weapons testing out in that wilderness that no one wanted examined. Or maybe Ivanov, the one man who stood over those bodies, who read every report, who saw all of it firsthand, noticed something in the evidence that he could never prove and was never permitted to say out loud. So here is where the evidence actually leaves us, and it's an honest place. The most probable truth is natural. A slab of snow, a desperate retreat, the indifferent cold. Each famous horror, the missing tongue, the radiation, the crushing force, has a real, grounded explanation. And together they tell a coherent and heartbreaking story of 9 people who did almost everything right and died anyway. But most probable has never meant certain. And there is that thin seam the snow can't quite cover. The orange lights that other people watched with their own eyes. The survival math that doesn't perfectly close. And the lead investigator who carried to the end of his life the belief that the official story he signed was not the whole truth. 9 experienced hikers cut their way out of a warm tent and walked into a 40-below night because something convinced them it was the safer choice. We can finally say with real confidence what probably drove them out onto that slope. We still cannot say for certain what they were so afraid of. On Dead Mountain, the snow eventually gave up the bodies. It has never quite given up the answer.